Okay, I think we're underway, and welcome back. Again, my name's Paul Herbert. I have the privilege of being the executive director of this institution. I spent almost all my adult life up until a few years ago as an officer of the United States Army, and so I thought I would share with you some of that experience that I hope will be useful at the secondary school level where all of you perform such heroic work. And I greatly appreciate Professor McDougall's comments and a very fascinating discussion of the broad outlines of American military history. I'll try not to repeat much of what he said. However, I will use the slides behind me. I'll try not to read them to you, but I may even do that on occasion. That's out of long habit, so I hope you'll forgive me on that. Notice that I've changed the title slightly. On your agenda it says The Basics, as if what I have to say is everything there is to lay a foundation, and I decided that was probably not quite appropriate, and so it's Some Basics as I see those basics. I take the inspiration from this talk from the distinguished military historian Maurice Matloff, who in the general text for Army ROTC on American military history wrote that military history is a combination of general history and military art and science, and that it lies at the intersection of diplomatic, political, social, cultural, economic, and intellectual trends in American history with military affairs. And I know that every one of you is very familiar with the general history of the United States. Several of you are well familiar with American military history and the military experience. But I think in my modest work here with teachers that one of the reasons that military history is not as well presented in secondary schools as it might be is that many teachers know that that's terra incognita. They are not themselves veterans. They haven't. They approach the military as sort of a foreign world full of jargon. They're a little bit unsure about how to organize their thinking about war and warfare and things like that. And so there's avoidance from lack of confidence. And I'm here to tell you that you can teach military history without being a soldier, as well as you can teach politics without being a politician, law without being a lawyer, economics without being an economist, or any other discipline that is fundamental to our national story. And so I want to encourage you, I'm going to share with you some of the basics of that organization, and then hopefully answer your questions in a way that is useful and helpful to you. And I got to remember to change my slides. There. Why should we teach American military history, Professor McDougall? These are the two questions that I want to answer in this short talk. Why should we teach it, and how can we teach it? And here are the reasons that I think are important. And Professor McDougall has already stated or alluded to these. The first is, I think you have to teach American military history in order to understand American history. And Professor McDougall has already made this point. Whether we like it or not, the story of our nation is intimately and inextricably wound around the issue of war and peace. Wars have had tremendous consequence for the United States. The defense of the United States is a highly problematic political, emotional, cultural, and social issue. And so I think to leave American military history out of the national story is to really degrade the national story considerably and to risk ignorance of who we are as a people. I would make an observation in addition to Professor McDougall's remarks that part of the national quality of our population for generations has been the presence among them of people vulnerable to military service, whether they volunteer or are conscripted, and people who are veterans and have served, and that's an important dimension of our society and our culture. The second reason that I think is very, very important is to preserve civilian control of the military. I'll say a few more words about this, and then Professor Peter Maslowski will talk about the origins of the American Armed Forces and the military clauses of the Constitution. We are a very, very lucky nation in our relationship between our people, our government, and our military. Largely in American military history, our Army is not feared by our people. That's amazing. I think many of you can think of people that you know who live in other nations who have either experienced great fear of their military or fear their military today. But we can't take that for granted. If we don't educate a rising generation in civilian responsibility for military affairs, we could lose it. We could outsource our own defense in the way that we outsource so many other things in American society today. The third reason that I think it is important is to foster informed ethical reasoning with regard to war, defense, and military service. All of these issues are not going to disappear from the national agenda anytime soon. All of your students are either facing them today or will face them in the next couple of years or will face them as citizens, whether they're policymakers and politicians or military leaders or like ourselves, taxpayers and voters and people who are concerned about the future of our own lives and the future of our country, the future of our children. And so to ignore that subject with all of its ethical complications and problems, I think, is to do young people a disservice. Let me say that in making that remark, I think it's very important to say to ourselves and to our colleagues that to know about war is not to advocate war. And it's my perception that some of the disappearance of military history from American history and from global history is distaste for the subject itself. It's a manifestation of the peace-loving side of our nature. It is a terrible, terrible thing, and it is to be avoided. And I don't think anyone in their right mind would say, I have the solution to this problem, let's fight a war. To know about military affairs, to talk about the experience of war, to understand it, to frame it, to criticize it, is not to be an advocate of war, necessarily, nor is it to be subliminally a recruiter of young people into the military services. Teachers, I think, can approach this subject very, very well in class without doing either one of those things, which would be inappropriate, I think, in a classroom. So then I'm going to offer this humble framework. If you're setting out to teach American history with all of the things, all of the themes that compete for your attention and your energy, and military history is one of those, and you want to address it, what do you have to know? I would argue that there are a set of foundational ideas or themes or whatever you want to call them that you ought to get your mind around at the outset. And we'll have far more distinguished speakers than I address many of those that I'll suggest here in a second. And then you talk about America's wars. And you talk about what changes in these themes and why do they change. And through that, we do what historians and history teachers always do, and that's provide vicarious experience to students that enriches their ability to recognize and deal with similar analogous issues in their own time and in the future. I think a lot of our the trend in the discipline of history today toward cultural and social issues, very enriching, but it is pushed aside more traditional political diplomatic history in many respects. And one of the things that I think falls very quickly off the table is the actual conduct of war. And so in my remarks today, I hope to equip you with some ideas that you could take out of here and keep, this is a, forgive the Army slang, but keep them in your rucksack for the time that they would be useful to you as you think about how to teach the major periods of American history and address all of the trends and topics that need to be addressed. So here are those foundational ideas. The first is that war and conflict are enduring human experiences with profound consequences. Now that's a blinding flash of the obvious. But it is also a fact. War and conflict are as old as humanity. And whether we wish for a more peaceful future or not, they are likely to remain so. And so anything that is so directly and powerfully part of our experience as human beings ought to be dealt with in the classroom. There's a corollary, at least from my point of view, to that fact. And I think it's a corollary that undergirded the creation of our own country and the military clauses of the Constitution that we'll talk about later. And that is that an ability to defend a country is a requirement of sovereignty. And if you cannot defend your country, however you conceive of that, and for whatever reasons, and if you cannot defend its interests, and you can't defend its people, if you cannot defend its constitutional composition, then perhaps you do not have a nation after all. So that's one theme that I would certainly want my students to take away from a course in American history. The next thing is I would want them to know about the military clauses of the Constitution. Our Constitution, a document that almost all of us revere, was established, as we all know, in order to provide for the common defense and to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our prosperity. And it is far more powerful than that, and I'll let Professor Maslowski talk about this. But the Constitution, as you know, separates the powers of government over the military and over war making. And it is very sophisticated and has endured through the ages in how this country approaches defense and war and the military. It is very, very important that students appreciate why those things were framed in the first place and how they have been manifested in our national past, what stresses are upon them today, what solutions might be found to those stresses, and what they might anticipate in the future during their own lives as citizens. I think it's important to know something about America's military institutions, principally the armed forces, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, Coast Guard, some would argue the Merchant Marine, there are others, the Department of Defense, once it is created, the War Department. I think those are important institutions in American history. People ought to be familiar with them. And then finally, of course, the causes, conduct, and consequences of the wars that we've fought. Now, let me say just a word about American military institutions. There are several things that you can look at when you consider the history of one of our services. Let's take the United States Army. The first is you could track change in the primary purposes and actual roles of our armed forces. Why do we create an army? What is it for? Not what is it for in the general sense, conceptual sense, and what is it for specifically in any particular era of American history? And then another question you can ask is, if that's what it was formally prepared to do, did it do that or did it perform some other role? The obvious example is in the expansion of the United States across this continent. One of the very, very important roles played by the United States Army was facilitating that expansion by exploration, by engineering, and a host of other auxiliary services that had very little to do with warfighting, but exploited the competence of military organizations in a whole host of technical fields, as well as their competence in organization, planning, and operations. I think that we should look at American military institutions as instruments of policy, because they are. Primarily and foremost, our armed forces are instruments of American policy, both foreign and domestic. And you could take the same chart that Professor McDougall provided us with in his remarks that lists American wars in chronological order, and says here are the foreign provocations and the domestic supporters and the domestic opponents. You could do the same thing, and you could say, okay, let's look at the United States Army or the United States Navy. What was the policy of the United States? And did this particular instrument support that policy? Was it a useful tool? A wonderful example of that is the American Army on the verge of the First World War. That is important to this institution because it's when the 1st Division was created. We had an army that was designed to protect this continent from a foreign invader. And it was organized into regiments. And most of those regiments and the National Guard were deployed along our border with Mexico, ironically, in order to stabilize that border area from the effects of the Mexican Revolution. When President Woodrow Wilson promised Marshal Joffre in the spring of 1917 that he would come to the rescue of the Allies by sending immediately a division, Secretary of War Newton Baker had to say, Mr. President, we have no divisions. And I'm making all the rest of this up, of course, but I can imagine the president saying, shh, 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 shh. Just get a division, you understand? And so they picked 4 regiments, actually 7 regiments when you count the artillery regiments, sent them from Texas post-haste by train, and the 1st Division was literally organized on the docks of Hoboken, New Jersey, and 4 days later boarded the transports and went across the Atlantic, landing at Saint-Nazaire and marching on a 4th of July ceremony in Paris, going through the Arc de Triomphe and ending at the cemetery where Lafayette is buried in the famous words, Lafayette, we are here. The first of 49 divisions that we would deploy in that conflict. And the 1st Division, a little bit of commercial ad if you'll forgive me, the 1st Division, permanently established combined arms division in American military history. We still have those divisions. The 1st Division has been on continuous active duty since the 8th of June, 1917, and currently has 6,000 young Americans deployed in Iraq. I digress. Our American military institutions are a reflection of American culture in every era and generally, for better or worse. And believe it or not, even in today's highly select, all-volunteer, very professional, very small, probably unrepresentative military, there are the same stresses we just talked about between our peace-loving nature and our warlike nature. And so whatever problems you want to examine in American society, you will find them reflected in the armed forces of the United States. I can testify to this. I became a commissioned officer in 1972 in an army that was the wreckage of an army because of the horrible experience it had had through the Vietnam years. And I don't just mean the war in Vietnam, I mean all the complications of that era. And most of my first 2 to 3 years as an officer in the United States Army were spent trying to prevent AWOL and race riots and drug abuse. And I've had the experience of teaching an American soldier how to spell his name so he could sign the receipt for his pay. Now, that's a reflection of American culture at that particular point in time. And the idea that we could take that army somewhere, for instance, in the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, and intervene between 2 major combatants that were armed to the teeth is amazing. So our armed forces, in many, many, many more ways than that, reflect our culture. They are part of ourselves. They are themselves social institutions, and therefore very, very interesting to examine. They have their own culture. They have their own organization. They are to some degree a closed society, and that's very problematic in American history. Professor McDougall alluded to the professional army that in some would characterize as more closed than any other part, and then there's our whole body of citizen soldiers who are in the military only as a part-time job to go when they're needed, very patriotic, but it is not the the definition of their being. It is not their career. It is something that they do like a volunteer fire department may do. So the degree to which these institutions are open or closed and their internal dynamics is a subject of legitimate inquiry. And that gets us to the profound issue of who serves and why do they serve. And we have addressed that question in every single era of American history differently. We have been through the citizen soldier emphasis, the militia emphasis, the all-volunteer emphasis, the conscription emphasis. There was a time when conscription was executed by the military. Uniformed members of the Provost Marshal's Corps were the people in the towns deciding who gets conscripted. There has been a time when it's done by your friends and neighbors, from whom you get a cheerful little note that says greetings. But there is a time when we have excluded important minority groups. There has been a time when those minority groups have had to fight for equality inside our military institutions in the same way that they fight for equality in our society at large. The Army into which I was commissioned had very, very, very few women, and they were all in something called the Women's Army Corps. Of course, women play a very prominent role throughout our armed forces today. They are in harm's way directly throughout Iraq and Afghanistan, and I don't know how many of you know this, because it probably hasn't been carried in the American press. Do you know that the first woman since World War II was decorated a few months ago with the Silver Star, one of our nation's highest awards for valor in direct combat? Her name is Sergeant Hester. You can't read about that in the mainstream press anywhere, but you can find it in 2 editions of Army Magazine that I'd be glad to show you at some time later in our time together here. And finally, all of this implies that I think the civil-military relationship is an extremely important matter for all of us as voters, taxpayers, and soldiers, but I think that it is also an important matter for our students to be introduced to and encouraged to understand and be curious about and have an informed opinion about. Now, so there's a whole list of things that you could say, okay, I'm going to look at those and I'm going to ask how those change over time as I teach American military history or American history, and I think you'd be doing a service to your students. And I don't think that those are any more unapproachable for any of you than any other discipline you're called upon to be knowledgeable about. These are, of course, America's wars. This list is almost identical to Professor McDougall's. I've elected to include some of our most important, less formal wars, the colonial wars prior to our own independence, and the ongoing conflict with Native Americans that defined the role of the United States Army for more than a century of our history. I think it's important that we recognize that we have not only fought major episodic foreign wars, but we have been constantly in a situation of conflict where we have used our armed forces in a variety of ways, for better or ill, to carry out national policy short of formal war. I'm chagrined that I didn't put on this list, and I didn't even think about it until I listened to the previous speaker's remarks, but I think it counts as a war. And it is the context of Korea and Vietnam. It was the Cold War that we waged from 1947 to 1991, characterized prominently by the advent of atomic and then nuclear weapons. That problem has not disappeared from the planet. It changed America's thinking about war in profound ways, and we can't pretend now that because the Soviet Union has disappeared and we don't have that same problem, that the horror of mutual annihilation with atomic weapons has disappeared as a problem from the planet. Those are the major milestones in which you could you could pass the issues that I just talked about and identify continuity and change. So that gets me to my main point. All that's introduction. And that's the conduct of war. A secondary school teacher should be reasonably comfortable with these terms and should be able to integrate them into a general course in U.S. history, identifying change and its causes and continuity in its causes. If you go to a war college or a staff college or to one of the military academies, you will be immersed in this kind of stuff. It is our profession, and so there are all sorts of nuances that we argue about constantly that we don't even understand ourselves. And if you got into a college, into one of the war colleges and sat around a seminar table, undoubtedly in a few minutes without any introduction, you'd be very confused as to what the heck we were talking about. But in like manner, if I were introduced into a high-powered academic session in nuclear physics or civil engineering or the higher forms of the art of economics, I'd be lost. That doesn't mean that that at its base that this is a subject that we cannot be reasonably competent. So as a military person, when we think about war, we define three levels, or we identify three levels: strategy, operations, and tactics. In civilian lexicon, these get used all the time interchangeably. People talk about the tactics of the Second Front in the Second World War or something like that. But actually, this is a hierarchy. Strategy is at the top, operations is in the middle, tactics is at the bottom, and the boundaries between them are a source of legitimate argument and discussion and differences of opinion among scholars and professionals, and they vary from era to era and place to place depending on the nature of the war in question. But as a general historical proposition, strategy is the overall concept for using military power to achieve one or more political ends. And in Western culture, and certainly American culture, our primary concept of military power is to achieve political ends. That's not the same in all cultures by any means. And once you've decided your overall concept for how you'll use military power, you then go into the realm of operations. And operations is the actual utilization of major military forces. We define it as the positioning and movement of major forces, field armies, air forces, fleets, to gain advantages over the enemy. In operations, you may have people fighting or you may not have people fighting. But the point of the matter is, it is the art of translating the political concept, the strategy, into practical military activity. And then tactics is a little lower in the hierarchy. It's the art of winning battles and engagements. Then we use two terms in military history: campaigns and battles. Campaigns are a planned sequence of operations and engagements intended to lead to a strategic goal. They don't always. The enemy always votes, and I'll come back to that idea in a little bit. And then battle, of course, is the violent collision of forces, usually in a discrete time and place. Now, I'm going to take a very familiar example and just talk about this a little. This is a conventional war. It's a well-known war. It's the Second World War. And this is the Western Front of the Second World War just prior to the Battle of the Bulge. And it illustrates some strategic considerations. Here, of course, is Normandy, where the Allies had come ashore and after a month of fighting had broken out and swept at a unanticipated rapid rate across France, liberating Paris, almost destroying two German armies, with the British and Canadians in the north and the Americans to the south of that, and executing what General Eisenhower at the time and historians since have called the broad front strategy, which is to pursue the Germans toward the western border of Germany with all forces across the entire face of northern France, Belgium, the Benelux countries. This is Operation Market Garden, right here, executed in September of 1944. There's Normandy. And so this is the situation in the fall of 1944. Now, what this represents is the culmination of Allied strategy, hotly debated principally by the Americans and the British throughout the war, with sometimes problematic dispatches from Joseph Stalin, who we ought never to forget, is also fighting this same enemy with tens of millions of soldiers on the Eastern Front. The Allies had decided that the way to defeat the Germans, the strategic choice was the way to use military power to defeat Nazi Germany is to confront it directly. The great dispute was between the British and the soft underbelly out of the Mediterranean and the Americans, who said, no, we ought to build up in England, cross the Channel, force our way ashore, go straight for Berlin by the shortest route, destroy as many enemy armies as we possibly can, occupy his soil, and entirely defeat him. In fact, what we did is kind of a combination of the two. The Americans thought that this was possible in 1943. They actually had to wait a year, 1944, and then it never went quite as fast or as furiously as anticipated. Now, the other things show the German counter to this. And this is a strategic idea. Those are the Ardennes and the Eifel in Germany on the west and east side, respectively, of the Siegfried Line and the western border of Germany. There were hardly any Allied troops in there because it's very, very, very tough ground. And this is where Hitler decided that he would counter this American advance as it was running out of steam logistically in the fall of 1944. And even though he was hard-pressed on all fronts, he marshaled a fairly significant group of armies, and he said, what you guys are going to do is attack into the Allies and seize Antwerp. And I'll talk about this more in a few minutes, but Antwerp was absolutely critical to the logistical support of the Allied armies. And even though it had been liberated by the British, the mouth of the rivers here had not been cleared. You can see that there are still German forces, and so the port itself, which is inland, was not usable. And so Hitler decided that we will attack through the Ardennes, we'll turn north, we'll go all the way to Antwerp, we'll seize Antwerp, deny that objective to the Allies like this, and then perhaps split the British forces in the north off from the American forces in the south, precipitating a political crisis, get the two of them fighting each other, politically fighting each other, and we can make a separate peace in the west in time to turn all of our divisions around, take them back across Germany, and take on the Soviet Union. So that was the plan, and that sets up the famous Battle of the Bulge. My point on all that is that's an illustration of strategy, both Allied strategy and German strategy. It sets up, let's see, and there's the planned route. Two towns, Bastogne and St. Vith, that were defended heroically by American troops and are part of the reason why it failed. And that's another story. This is a closer look at the same area. There's the U.S. First Army, which had only 2 divisions along the front. One of them, the battered 28th, that had been shot up in the Hürtgen Forest and was recovering. The other, the 106th, which had only been in country about 30 days. The Germans assembled in the Eifel under the cover of bad weather and tough terrain and forests. The 6th SS Panzer Army, the 5th Panzer Army, and the 7th Army. And then they said, okay, what you guys are going to do is attack into the Allied front, and you've got to seize 5 routes that will lead us to the Meuse River, indicated by that blue line. And here are the 5 routes. And they said, if we get all 5 of those routes, then we've got enough traffic ways to get our armor and artillery and our logistics up to the Meuse River. We got to cross the Meuse River, pass 4 more divisions across the Meuse River, press on to Antwerp. By that time, we're in the Allied rear. We're going to capture and destroy their supplies as we go, seize Antwerp, and this will be the great operation that wins the war in the West. And we could talk more about that, and I love to do so, and my staff will tell you that you should avoid the experience. But at any rate, this is an example of the operational art, for better or worse. This is the translation of a strategic idea to fight in the West, seize Antwerp, into practical, executable military activity. It's an operational plan, and so that illustrates operations. The 1st Infantry Division fought on the northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge. They had been in continuous contact with the enemy since June 6, 1944. This attack occurred on December 16, 1944. On December 5th, 1944, they were pulled out of the line for a long overdue rest and refit, having lost hundreds of troops in what some would argue was a problematic battle in the Hurtgen Forest. On December 16th, as their soldiers, as replacements were arriving, people were being issued new duffel bags and introduced to the Army. Soldiers were being sent off to hospitals, and many of them were on their way to cities in Belgium or even to Paris on leave. The word came, stop all that, we're going back, get on the trucks, we're leaving right now. They boarded the trucks, headed off 40 miles, and went back into contact, heroically helping to hold the northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge, and they remained in contact with the enemy until VE Day, May 8, 1945. These were soldiers that were in it for the duration, come what may. This illustrates the little towns of Boulingen and Buchenbach, Belgium, which are on the northern shoulder. That is the Eisenberg Ridge, being heroically held against the German onslaught by the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions. This is the town of Boulingen. It's occupied by the Germans who are pressing west. Mind you, their plan requires that they reach the Meuse River in the first day. So what they want to do is go, 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 go if they possibly can. This is rough country and it's hard for tanks. They've identified a route shown here that goes to the little town of Buchenbach as critical to their advance. It is called Rollbahn C. The 5 routes were Rollbahns, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, A, B, C, D, E, from north to south. This is Rollbahn C. The 1st Infantry Division and 1 battalion of the 1st Infantry Division, the 2nd Battalion, 26th Infantry, about 450 troops, most of whom are brand new replacements, arrives on the scene and is deployed to this little manor farm of Dom Buchenbach. And are told, hold that at all costs, and they do for 5 days. This is another example of operations, both the German operations and the American operations. This is a map of that same area. There's Buchenbach, there's Boulingen, there's Dom Buchenbach, and all the graphics on here, which probably look strange to you, I understand them immediately, and my fellow veterans in here will as well. But they're all easily explained. Those are the names of companies. So Company A was there, Company K was there. These are platoons of E Company, with 3 little dots there. But what this shows you, this actually is from our archives downstairs and is the actual overlay used by the regimental commander, Colonel Seitz. His name is here. His S3's initials are right here, Major Clisson. That's how they deployed the regiment to defend Dom Buchenbach. And then the fight that it begins starts on the 17th of December when the 1st SS Panzer Division, in fact, trying to find its way along Rollbahn D, farther to the south, stumbles into Boulingen, alerts the Americans, but decides they don't want to go that way. They want to get back to where they're supposed to go, and so there's a little firefight, and then they drift off to the south. And then the next SS Panzer Division on December 18th. And then the 12th tries again on December 19th. And on December 19th again from 2 directions simultaneously. And on December 20th again twice from 2 directions simultaneously. And then finally a major attack at dawn, December 21st, 1944 by the 12th SS Panzer Division reinforced. This is one, if you'll forgive the term, hellacious fight. And I could tell you about the details of it later, but time prohibits. The point of the matter is, this is tactics. This is tactics. This is on the battlefield. How do we in engagements? How do we fight? What is one commander thinking? What is the other commander thinking? How does it go? It's an illustration of tactics, and so that's the difference between those 3 levels of war. I'm back to the strategy now. You should be able to talk about logistics and intelligence. Logistics is the art of sustaining and moving military forces in the field or at sea. And it's hugely important. There's an antiquated phrase among professional soldiers that amateurs talk about tactics. Professionals talk about logistics. Now, I don't know if that's true, but the fact of the matter is you've got no military power at all if you can't deploy it to where it's needed and sustain it while it's there. And so we read about the tremendous problem of IEDs, of improvised explosive devices that are doing so much damage to our soldiers in Iraq. We rarely talk about the huge ongoing logistical effort that's necessary to sustain those soldiers. And I bet the bulk of the American public doesn't pay much attention to the fact that most of our logistical apparatus to support our troops in Afghanistan goes by rail through the Russian Federation. Intelligence is the art of determining the enemy's intentions, capabilities, and vulnerabilities in advance. And I think those are intuitive ideas that you're all certainly familiar with. If we go back to how logistics affected the broad front strategy, I'll give you just one example in the interest of time. To sustain one American division in combat for a day, not attacking, just on the front, in 1944, required 650 tons to be delivered to that division every day. 650 tons. Fuel, ammunition, repair parts, supplies, replacement vehicles, you name it. The whole litany of stuff. The plan for liberating Europe said that by D+90, sometime in early September of 1944, the United States Army would have 12 divisions in France, and they would be 120 miles off the beaches, located generally along the Seine River, where there would be an operational pause while we reorganized our logistics for a second push farther to the north in the direction of Germany. By D+90, we had 16 such divisions, and they were 270 miles from where they had landed at Normandy, and the Normandy ports had not been open, and Antwerp was still in German hands. So you can see the exponential increase in the requirement to keep these armies and soldiers moving against the enemy. The issue was the Germans are retreating and have been practically destroyed. Can we not push on into Germany, mop this thing up, and win the war by Christmas? The problem is that a division or an army that has to go on the offensive requires reserves of logistical supplies that it is just physically impossible to deliver in order to take advantage of the military opportunity. So the issue of logistics, once I've talked about Antwerp a couple of times, once Antwerp was finally cleared, this is how important it was. By March of 1945, the port of Antwerp is handling 35% of all logistics entering the European theater for the Allies, 35%. So it is a tremendously important issue. The ability to continue to sustain your forces is a tremendously important issue. I could talk also, I'm probably pressing up against my time, so I'm going to be a little bit careful here, but I could talk also about intelligence. The whole Ardennes battle is rife with intelligence and counterintelligence by both sides. Suffice it to say that the Germans pulled it off, and nobody thought they could. As a matter of fact, there are some historians who consider that there was a certain amount of hubris among the Allied high command at the time. That we had the Germans on the ropes, that we were safely ashore, that we had liberated Paris. Yeah, we had some supply issues, but by gosh, we were taking it to these guys, and if we could just get into Germany, we could end this war. They're going to continue to retreat. Hitler played on that by codenaming the operation for the counterattack through the Ardennes Wacht am Rhein, watch on Rhine. And if you hear that, it has a defensive, a security connotation. Now, he did lots of other things to deceive the fact that he was planning this counterstroke. There are historians who argue that we should have picked up on those signs. We had Ultra. We had a number of other sources. It has to do, I guess, with the fog of war, suffice it to say, and it wasn't the only time. Pearl Harbor is another example. The Tet Offensive is another example. 9/11 is another example. It isn't the only time that our ability to detect in advance the capabilities, vulnerabilities, and intentions of potential or real enemies has failed us. It's an important issue in war, and it's part of strategy, operations, and tactics. I think you should be reasonably comfortable with the idea of technology and organization. The application of science to the practice of war over our history is a tremendously important issue. One example, the atomic revolution, okay, kind of changed everything about how we thought about war and strategy. And there was a period there through the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s where the military, quite frankly, was kind of out of the game. It's the era of the civilian practitioners of strategy, because the old saying that war is too important to be left to the generals became almost literally true when people feared that the brass suits in the Pentagon might take us to a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. Technology is integrated into military forces through organization. Organization is how you arrange the functions and purposes of military elements to be effective and efficient in combat. It's a tremendously important thing. It gets you into the business of wiring diagrams, and I know all of you, when you see one of these wiring diagrams of what a division looks like, say, oh my goodness, what am I doing with that? And I wouldn't recommend that you spend a whole lot of time in them, but you should have some appreciation for how military forces are organized and the advantages and disadvantages of that organization. And oh, by the way, the organization of American military forces throughout our history reflects similar and analogous practices in the history of management, the history of science, the history of education, the progressive era, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, and that's another reflection of American culture and American military institutions. So that's very important. That leads to combat power. Combat power is the idea that any given military unit, a platoon, squad, company, army, it doesn't matter, has a certain amount of capability to do in a given environment what it was designed to do, and that's called combat power. And then if you're looking at two opponents, you compare them, and that's a force ratio. My United States Army makes a high religion of analyzing combat power and force ratios, and more so maybe 15 or 20 years ago than today, but it's an intuitive idea. If you take the Battle of Bull Run, there is a Union Army there and there is a Confederate Army there, and just like two fighters or two wrestlers, they have strengths and weaknesses, and we can, to a certain degree, we can appreciate which one is stronger, which one is more likely to operate effectively. And oh, by the way, our country, our Congress, the Department of Defense, and all the other institutions make those choices in advance. That's what the whole defense budget is about, is how do we organize potential military power in our economy and society into real military power adequate for our defense. It's a matter of thinking about these issues. This is Army Group B. These are the three armies, 5th Panzer, 6th SS Panzer, and 7th Army that the Germans organized. I won't drag you through this. I will point out that there are armies, and in the 20th century, below those generally, there are corps, and below corps there are divisions. And there is a wonderful handout in your welcome packet that FPRI has provided you with about the Army and history. And it's got a little cheat sheet on there that tells you the hierarchy of squads, platoons, regiments, brigades, all that stuff that just sort of swims around out there if you're not a practitioner of the trade. And I commend that to you as well as many of the other little pieces of information on that. I'm not going to analyze this, but suffice it to say that I was all set to give you a thumbnail analysis that talked to, it's not just numbers. It's not just how many troops. It's what are they armed with? How are they led? When were they trained? How well disciplined are they? How well motivated are they? Many of these troops were drafted out of the German Luftwaffe because their Air Force had been shot out of the air. They didn't need that many people in the Air Force anymore. And so in about a space of 30 to 90 days, they reminted them as soldiers and put them in these units. So there's a whole bunch of considerations, subjective and objective, that you can bring to this analysis of combat power. Finally, combat. And the quote at the top, I think, is my favorite, or one of my favorite Clausewitzian quotes. As an Army officer, I've had to digest a tremendous amount of Clausewitz. I don't recommend that you start at the beginning and read to the end. I recommend that you get a good guide to Clausewitz's On War. But the first quote, I think, is tremendously important for anybody teaching military history seriously. A picture of war as a whole may be formed by imagining a pair of wrestlers. Each tries through physical force to compel the other to do his will. Too often, our history of our wars is a narrative, a chronological narrative that starts at the beginning and works step by step to the end and the grand and victorious conclusion, or in some cases, the tragic defeat. And we forget about the enemy. At every step in those wars, there is at least one other party trying just as hard to execute his strategy against us, to defeat our purposes, to make us fail. And the dynamic of combat, so often misunderstood by many, many people, is that the issue is always in doubt until it is decided. The other side can always win. We did not know, and it was not foreordained that Normandy would work. It was a horrific risk. David Eisenhower's grandfather's finest moment as a soldier may have been when he wrote out the message to be released to the media in the event the invasion failed, accepting upon himself full and complete personal responsibility. He did not know when he made that decision to change the invasion from its planned day of June 5th to June 6th that it would work. Decisions like that are made by corporals, sergeants, lieutenants, captains, colonels, lieutenant colonels every minute of an actual operation. And understanding that dynamic is tremendously important. No other human activity is so continuously or universally bound up with chance, through which guesswork and luck come to play a great part in war. We can only force it out of the experience to a limited degree by reason and rationality and discipline and order and organization and planning and so on and so forth. More quotes from Clausewitz, equally important. Everything in war is very simple, but the simplest thing is so difficult, and the difficulties accumulate to a kind of friction in which one always falls far short of the intended goal. And anybody who's even tried to move a platoon through a thickly vegetated area in the middle of the night in the days before night vision devices and GPS will know that everything in military operations, although simple, move these 30 people from here over to the top of that hill, is tremendously difficult. These are analytical cues. I'm not going to go through them. They're straight out of Army doctrine. As a matter of fact, straight out of Army doctrine at the time I was in the Army. I retired 5 years ago. They've probably replaced these with a computer screen device of some kind that answers all these questions. But at any rate, if you want to consider terrain and a very quick synthesis of some of the variables you look at when you're thinking about a battle and tactics, those are there. The Army has struggled, and America has struggled for years as to whether there's principles of war. We say that there are, and here they are. And they're relatively intuitive ideas, understanding and appreciating how they combine and why we think they exist. You don't have to say that they do exist. Just understanding whether they exist is important to understanding war. There is no avoiding what war is. War is killing. Patton's speech, to make the other poor dumb bastard die for his country, that may be a little crude, but war is not a good human experience. It is killing and death and pain and fear and terror and chaos and exhaustion and horror and destruction. War is a bad human experience. Sometimes wars are necessary. And wars tend to bring out some awfully admirable qualities in human beings because they are such tremendously intense. It is such a tremendously intense experience. And so the warrior, who is both terrified and exhausted and wanting to go home, is also a person who can be quite noble, quite determined, quite disciplined, quite committed, and someone who is deserving for having said, whether told by the government or volunteered to do so, having said, I'll accept the risk of that terror and put myself between my country and whatever issue is at stake, is to be admired and respected, whatever the outcome of that decision may have been for him or her. I've got some pictures that illustrate that. They're all from the Battle of the Bulge. Bad guys smoking the cigarettes and reading the mail of the American GIs they just killed. Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Daniels' command post in the immediate aftermath of the war. The tank you see in the foreground is German, the tank to the left is American. That kind of point-blank fighting among tanks happened 5 times on top of his command post, but he did not withdraw. Civilians on the battlefield have always been there and always will, and war is a horror for them. And these Belgians are trying mightily in the coldest winter in 300 years of European history to leave their homes and get out of the way of the Allied and German armies. And young men no different than this, particularly Rocky Moretto here on the left, who is still very much alive and comes to visit us every now and then, were the heroes who won this battle and have won all of America's wars. Whether we still have citizen soldiers, well, yes, we always have citizen soldiers. We always have citizen soldiers. And the reason is, having served 30 years, I will tell you that every one of those young Americans wearing the uniform of the United States is first and foremost a citizen. And so, yes, we have citizen soldiers, and there are 3 of them. Here are some more. That's Colonel Daniels, who led those 451 wonderful GIs in that particular battle. There were many, many other battles and many, many other examples of sterling leadership. And that is another quality that we can encourage our students to think about is leadership in tough times, whether it's in a military context or any other context. There were heroes like Corporal Henry Warner. Corporal Warner fought valiantly. He was manning an anti-tank gun. His position was attacked by 3 German tanks. They were closing through the fog at about 200 meters. They hit the first one and knocked it out, but they lost one of their crew. They hit the second one. They lost the rest of the crew. The third one continues to advance on Corporal Warner's position. He's terrified. His gun freezes. He can't reload it. He's the only guy there. There are 3 other soldiers dead and wounded, his buddies that he's been with since North Africa. He knows this tank is going to close and kill him. And he pulls his .45 caliber pistol out of his holster and stands behind his gun and fires like this into the face of that onrushing German tank. Bang, 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 until the clip is empty, and he dives into the fighting position behind his anti-tank gun, knowing that within seconds that tank is going to overrun the gun, overrun the fighting position, and crush him like a bug. And who knows what his thoughts were going through his mind as he huddled in the bottom of that foxhole. And nothing happened. And a few minutes went by, and he heard the enemy tank shifting gears. And he crept out like this and looked over the shield of his anti-tank gun to see the German tank withdrawing, with the tank commander who had come up through the hatch, slumped over like this, bleeding down the side of the tank because he'd been hit in the chest by, whoo, just like that, by one of Corporal Warner's .45 caliber bullets. For that, Warner was badly wounded, but he refused medical attention, went back out the next day, and was killed in action hunting another German tank with a bazooka. And for that, he received the Medal of Honor. This is another thing we can talk to students about. There are many military decorations that are awarded for distinguished service, for performing your duty. But a soldier's duty is profound. Profound, profound, profound. We reserve the Medal of Honor for those things that are above and beyond the call of duty. Nothing in Corporal Warner's duty, his duty required him to man that gun and kill those tanks until it was no longer possible to do so. Nothing about his duty required him to continue the fight by drawing a pistol and taking on an enemy tank. Nothing in his duty required him to refuse medical attention and stay in the fight in order to bolster the strength of his position despite the fact that he desperately needed medical attention. Nothing in his duty required to take the risk of taking a weapon in which he was not trained and volunteer to go out on a hunter-killer patrol in order to take out another enemy tank. And so Corporal Warner posthumously was awarded the Medal of Honor. Now, it doesn't just have to be, I think those examples are tremendously powerful, but it doesn't have to be in a military context. As we raise up young citizens, we should talk to them about duty, whether it is military or civic, and above and beyond the call of duty, and who are the people in our lives that have gone above and beyond the call of duty to make a difference for our country. This is an important issue, and it's something that we need to talk to students about. This is not just a piece of tin and a pretty ribbon that's awarded by the brass to soldiers who do well. It's awarded on our behalf. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to stop there with that in the background because that's what I have to say, and we'll take questions in just a second. But rather than me quack any more about World War II, I thought we should bring up somebody who was there. And it's my privilege to introduce to you Mr. Keen Butcher on the Board of Trustees, the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a distinguished veteran of the North African and Italian campaigns, having served with the 28th Infantry Division and the 34th Infantry Division with honor. And sir, it's my privilege to welcome you to the podium.
That's very difficult to follow. And my comments today are about today's military. It's a different world, but we are using the same words. I'm referring to reports we receive on a daily basis concerning our military forces, particularly the land contingent, but applicable to air and sea as well. In all American history, even during the Indian Wars, the enemy was generally identifiable as to individual, location, organization, and uniform. Also true in large part for the early aspects of this war. The power to destroy, however, from Hiroshima to today's IEDs, has drastically and permanently changed the destroy-defend equation in innumerable ways, increasing the effectiveness of the suicide bomber and his ilk. And our military, from the individual to the organizational, is adapting. Of course, that is not easy and seldom enough in a timely manner, plus coping with constantly higher levels of expectation. Now, in case you're hanging on my every word, I'm going to distribute this when I'm through talking with some additions of pictures somewhat similar to you saw up there. These comments are directed at what we read. This is a volunteer war, thank goodness, for the capacities and skill of the participants is at a proud high. They carry much heavier and complete burdens as a norm. The independent judgments are exercised at much lower levels. The material is more complex, useful, and productive, whether communication, firearms, vehicles, or myriad supplies. And it is still tough going. 2 generations ago, most of the population was familiar with some branch of the armed forces. At the end of World War II, there were 12 million men and women in American uniform out of a population then less than half our present size. Can you imagine 24 million today in uniform with a military budget of 38% of the gross domestic product against today's 4%? Military veterans are very few in the U.S. Congress or in educational institutions, and it shows. We lost 292,000 military killed in World War II, 34,000 in Korea, 48,000 in Vietnam, 148 in the Persian Gulf, about 3,000 civilians on 9/11, and a little more military than that in the 5 years in Iraq. Every loss is a tragedy, but life still requires all of us to take unavoidable chances, whether it's on the highway or in the bathtub, except nowadays we take showers instead. Reorganization is never as soon or as complete as desired. Even many of today's terms have different meanings. To the best of my knowledge, a brigade 2 generations ago was probably 2 regimental combat teams, 7 to 10,000 men, and today it might well be half that, with many times the flexibility and firepower. Military terms are used to describe command structures, but vary in usage. They may not have the same things inside them as you are familiar with or was talked about last year. Even war correspondents have difficulty describing what they try to report. We need to understand that a company stationed in Outer Mongolia, and we have military installations in all sorts of places like Outer Mongolia, and compared to Fort Dix, it's not a proper comparison, nor is equipment the same. Even today's helmet, for instance, has about 50 parts to make it more safe, more comfortable, and just as handsome. The Jeep is bigger, stronger, better equipped, and more rugged, with greater capabilities. This applies to every piece of military equipment, and needless to say, everything is more expensive and is so treated. Weapons and communications are particular areas where the technology and the capacities increase annually. We have been and are being attacked globally by an elusive enemy within civilian populations whom we are attempting to protect. Our enemies take advantage of our restraints and utilize our technologies against us. It is not easy, and leaving Iraq too soon will promptly multiply the risks and catastrophes at home and abroad. Because events are not presently going well does not change that. My thesis is simple. Being a soldier today is very different from what it used to be and totally unlike the experience of most of us. Do take that into consideration. Now, if you'd be good enough to pass down these things, Nancy, would you start them down? You don't have to ask me anything about them, but it might be informative, particularly the latter pages. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. And thank you for your service. Okay, so we've got a few minutes. Questions for myself or Mr. Butcher?
We can also take questions from the webcast, and those will be directed from me. But questions now?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
I have a question regarding what seems to be the decline in the teaching of military history. And I think a lot has to do with wanting history to be inclusive and the difference between what adolescent boys are interested in and what adolescent girls are interested in. Mm-hmm. For example, at my school, we offer an elective called World War II, and the teacher who teaches it, it's not just about battles, it's about the larger social and economic factors in war and all that. So this is something students can choose to do, and typically, you get 85% of the people who want to do it are boys, 10-15% maybe are girls. And I think that's part of what, in our efforts to make history more inclusive and more open to both boys and girls, I think we realize that girls are turned off by a lot of this.
Yeah.
Okay. So I just wanted to have some comment about that.
Well, this audience is far more capable than I of commenting on it because I'm not a secondary school teacher. We work with a lot of teachers here, and some of our staff have been teachers, but we're not currently teachers. I think it raises a perfectly legitimate point, and one of the things we are frequently asked to do, and we are delighted to do it, is provide teachers information about the experience of women in America's wars. They've been present in every single one of them, and many of them have served nobly and well, although it is truly a gendered experience as a generalization. It has been much more a male experience than a female experience in actual combat. We are often asked to provide information about all of America's cultural groups, principally African Americans, but also Hispanics, Asian Americans, and people of many ethnic groups. So part of the response to a demand for more inclusiveness is to look harder at our history and to say, okay, how do we make this relevant to an adolescent girl as well as an adolescent boy? in doing that, my only comment, and then I'll stop quacking about this subject, my only comment is I think we really have to be careful about allowing that sort of trend or any trend from displacing a core story. And I think the core story, a part of the core story of the Second World War or any war we fought is how was it waged and what were the consequences of that. And so I don't think we should use any topic of American history, but particularly not American military history, as merely a device to find some linkage to a group who we want to attract. We have to first be true to the actual story, and then secondly say, how can I make this important story to them as a citizen meaningful to the person, the individual that they are. Yes, sir, you were going to say something.
I was going to say, I've taught at two different gifted institutions, the Illinois Mathematics and Science Academy and the Indiana Academy, and I've taught several military history electives and run any number of independent studies, and I've always been about 50-50, male-female. I really don't think it relates to the military topic. I think young women are drawn to it because they realize the importance of it in a kind of a geopolitical reality as they come into the world. And if you present it as a leadership concept and a concept that they cannot enter into the higher ranks of the world without this knowledge, I have not seen them turn up. I think it really comes back to the teaching of it. And unfortunately, and this is where I would have another question about what you're doing here in general, how do you present this? I mean, the fact is that most of us have an interest, and so then we transcend the vast majority of our colleagues, and then most of them having gone to some form of first, second, third tier undergraduate institution where military history was either non-existent or had a negative impact, to which it's not even a matter of confidence, but a matter of absolute rejection. And I've had colleagues literally roll their eyes or make faces, or you had kind of fights over whether or not they were going to allow for such a course. The idea that you would worry about competence, you haven't even gotten to allowing. And not to beat a dead horse with that, but the other thing is that once it's presented, though, I really don't think that the gender role breaks out anymore. I think that's disappearing rapidly. And then it falls back to teaching.
And may do so as more and more women enter the service. And this becomes much more an issue of young citizens as opposed to young men. To your latter comment, and again, I'm not a secondary school teacher, so I can't make remarks with any great authority. But I lived a schizophrenic experience for 20 years. I had a PhD in history and was an infantry officer. And all my academic colleagues thought no real scholar would be in the infantry. He must be dumb. And my fellow soldiers thought, not all of them, I mean this is a gross exaggeration, but many of my fellow soldiers were highly suspect of why in the world I'd need that much education. And can a person with that much education really be useful in the ranks? And so I think one of the things, there are some people who will never convince, but I think we have to build alliances, and we have to persuade, and we have to try. And where I would come back to is the reasons that we teach it in the first place at the beginning. I think issues of war and peace are profoundly important to our future citizenry, and that they are part of our national experience, they are part of our constitutional being, and that we have a responsibility to address them in the classroom with the rising generation. I would stand on that ground and try to build as many alliances as I could and avoid or undermine the opposition. Was there another?
Okay, we have a question from the web.
Yes, sir.
From Isaac Hampton II at the University of Houston, asking, what are some of the standard books one should use to teach military history at the university level? What sort of media, DVDs would you recommend?
That's a wonderful question. The first thing you need is a general text. And there are several, but the one that comes immediately to mind was co-authored by our distinguished colleague here, Peter Meslowski, with Alan R. Millett, and the title is For the Common Defense. And it is a history of American military policy from our earliest times to the present. I still think that Russell Weigley's very, very powerful works, The History of the United States Army and American Way of War, are worth a read. There are many, many others. A more general text that is still very useful, although outdated, is Maurice Matloff's American military history, still used in ROTC detachments. I think it is wonderful. Each one of our colleagues here has written very powerfully on narrower topics of military history, but there is one that I would definitely commend to every high school teacher here, and the name of it, the author is Peter S. Kinsvater, K-I-N-D-S-V-A-T-T-E-R, Kinsvater, and the title is American Soldier. And it is a history of the experience of soldiering in the Army and Marine Corps in the 20th century. And if one of the things you want to know, because you yourself are not a veteran, is what was it like, this book will help you answer that question. It is powerful, and it's excellent. So those are the things off the top of my head. The other thing I would commend is that the handout that we had in our welcome packet on the history, on the Army and history, has a whole list of the Army's historical institutions, which are tremendous. Now, when it comes to the question of media, I'm kind of old-fashioned. I think people ought to read books, read primary materials, and write analytical papers. I think they ought to state and defend a thesis. I think they ought to listen to lectures, and they ought to critique lectures. But there is a whole host of other media available to us that is just rich. The internet and simulations and other things like that that is stimulating and rich and good military history. If you approach that critically as you would any other source for your classroom, I think you can find a lot of good stuff in there. And if you're anywhere near the 1st Division Museum, call us and we'll help you. We got lots of stuff. Okay. And are we done? Yeah. Thank you very much. Delighted to have you here.